Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. We're back again for video 3 of week 9. Now we're going to get into the nitty gritty of mixdown, and I'm actually going to perform a mixdown on this track, the one that I've been making since the very beginning, so that you guys can more or less follow along with yours, or you can watch the video and then apply what you've learnt afterwards, whichever way you feel more comfortable with. So now that we know a few more things about plugins that we can use for the mixdown, we can start to use those now that we have them in our bag. One thing when it comes to the mixdown that I like to do is, and this was a little tip that I learned quite a few years ago, is to just highlight all your tracks. If you have them grouped as well, make sure you highlight the top group, and then just bring them all right down so they're all negative infinite and there's absolutely no sound. So when I play this track now, there's nothing going on. You're probably confused as to why I'm doing this, but essentially what this process involves is bringing up each sound separately so that we can kind of reset our ears in a way. And as we bring each sound up, we can use our fresh ears and our fresh judgment to determine what sounds good at what volume. Because a lot of the time when you're making a track, you're going to get stuck in the same routine. So the track's more or less going to be at the same volume-wise. It's going to be the same from the close to the beginning till the end, and you don't really change it that much. Whereas if we come to this on a fresh day like I am now, and we drag all of the tracks down before we even listen to it, and then we bring each instrument up separately so that they fit with each other, that way we have a fresh new perspective, and we know that all the volumes will be sitting where we like them. Before I do that, I'm going to do a little bit of processing now that we've learnt about the drum bus and now that we've learnt about the returns. So I'm going to start to use those a little bit, and then I'll go through the mixdown process. So I've got our drums here. I think last time I used a saturator. So instead of the saturator, I'm just going to get rid of this now, and I'm actually going to use the drum bus. So I'll put a drum bus, put it before the reverb and the delay. With the drum bus, I kind of want it to affect the drums straight away, and then any other effects can happen after I've saturated or added character with the drum bus. So even when you throw a drum bus on, you don't actually touch anything because there's a slight amount of drive going on and it comes in at 100% dry wet. You will get some instant saturation from it. I'm just going to loop a section where the most drums are occurring. So let's say this section here. I'm just going to loop this and just tweak these drums a little bit. Probably don't want too much sub bass in this, it's not really a heavy track. I just want some soft saturation. I'm going to leave the transients, just the ever so slight amount of boom, and I'm just going to bring down the dry wet a touch. So this is just making my drums pop a little bit more. Cool, so I'm going to leave that. If you've done your drums like this, how I have on a drum rack, it's really easy because you can just throw the drum bus on the track and you're going to affect all the sounds. If you have done your drums separately, so let's say you had 3 tracks or whatever, however many tracks you had something like this going on. So you got all your drums separately here. What you can do is group these tracks. So hit Command G. And inside Ableton, you can actually add effects to the top group itself. So what this is going to do is it's going to affect everything underneath. So if I throw a drum bus on this top group, like this, I'm now affecting the kick, the snare, and the clap and the hat, even though they're on individual tracks. And same goes for any of these effects. So if I wanted to filter all 3 effects at once, instead of putting a filter on the kick, snare, and clap, the hat, I can just put it on the top group here, and I'll be affecting everything that's underneath. So let me just get rid of that. So if you have done your drum separately, instead of throwing a drum bus on each individual one, you can just process them as an entire group. And this little feature was introduced into Ableton recently. When I say recently, I mean in the last few years. So that really opened up a lot of doors for creativity and production and just general workflow. With groups as well, you can group within a group. So let's say I have a kick and snare here, and I want to process those separately once again. I can group those, and now I have a group. So let's say kick snare. I always put GRP if it's a group, just so I know what it is. So now I have a kick snare group with my kick and my snare. I can minimize this, and then I have the top group here, which is all my drums. So I can have a drum bus on this top group, but let's say if I wanted to add reverb to the kick and the snare, but not the hi-hat, because I've grouped them separately now, I can put it on the kick snare group, and now I've just got reverb that's affecting the kick and the snare, but not the hat because it's outside of that group, if that makes sense. So you can do as many groups within groups as you want. I mean, you can group again and again. Yeah, you don't really need to go too crazy with it. I'm sure 2 or 3 groups is enough. But the feature is there, and it's available if you want to use that. So if you need to process a couple of sounds separately to the others, and you have them all within a group, you can make another group within that group, and then do some extra processing on that, whatever you want to do. Okay, so that's just a little note if you did your drums separately. So I have this reverb on my drums here, and because we know about returns now, I could just send it to the return. But this is one of those situations where you do want the audio effect on the actual track itself, because I've automated this. I've automated the K time and the dry wet, and it's just for these drums. If I go ahead and start automating this in here, I'm going to be affecting everything that goes into this return, and I don't want to do that. So if you want to change the effects and automate them, I definitely recommend just to throw the effect onto the track itself instead of using the return. That's all I'm going to do for now on this one. Bass is pretty much fine there. So I'm just making sure everything's ready for the mixdown process so that all the creative things that I want to do to it are done. And then all I need to do for the mixdown process itself is compression, limiting, and EQ and that sort of stuff. As long as they sound like how I want them to sound, that's fine. So we got delay there. I'm just going to create a return. Make a long reverb. Make sure the dry wet's 100%. And I'll set this to something like 7 seconds. Oh, 7 seconds. I'll just send this flute to that return, so I'm going to actually delete this reverb here that's on the track. And now when you're in the arrangement view, to see the, how we're in the session view, we can see these sends here, like this. When we're in the arrangement view, it's these 3 boxes here. So you don't actually get a nice display like you do in the session view with the letters and the little knobs. Instead, it's just boxes that you drag up and down. So if you click them, you'll be able to see what it is as long as you're in automation mode. So if I'm out of automation mode, I won't know what it is. So I'll have to go back into automation mode, and then I'll be able to click on it and it should show it here. You can also tell what it is just by where it's positioned. So the first one's going to be A, the second one's going to be B, and then the third one will be C, and so on. So I'm going to send this flute to the long reverb. I want it to be quite wet, so I'm going to really crank this up. Yeah, probably somewhere around the max, to be honest. Okay, let's see what other effects we could consolidate. Nothing on there. So again, with these vocal chops, I've done some automation on the reverb itself with the decay time and dry wet, so I can't really send this to a return. This will have to be its own effect, so I'll leave that. Okay, this is pretty much ready. I've done all I want creatively to it. So what we can do is start the mixdown process itself. Instead of doing the mixdown, you know, like my compressing and my limiting, my EQing in here, I'm going to show you a slightly more efficient way to do it so you don't have to deal with all the plugins that you got in your project, especially if your project is getting up there track number wise. It's going to start to chug and slow down once you start processing it. So the best way, or the cleanest way to do a mixdown, is to export all of these tracks individually, bring them into a fresh Ableton Live session, and then we can start doing the mixdown in there. So that's what we're going to do, and it is good practice to do anyway. So before you do this process, you have to make sure all of your tracks are named properly, because whatever name that you've got on your track, that's how it's going to be exported. So if you have sound 1, sound 2, or audio track 1, audio track 2, and 3 and 4, and so on, you're going to have no idea what it is when you bring it into a fresh scene, and it just gets really messy. So make sure you name all of your tracks properly, and then that way you'll be ready for exporting. So when it comes to exporting this track, once I'm happy with how it's sounding creatively, so not worrying about compression, limiting, EQ, and that sort of stuff, I can now export this track, ready to do my mixdown process. The first thing is to make sure that this loop point is covering your entire track. So if there's a tail on the end here that you want to capture, you can just drag it out a little bit. Something sounds a bit weird there. I think the bass has gone off again. Yeah, it's doing the classic Ableton pitch glitch. Okay. Okay. So you just have to play it. I found that if you just play some points where it pitches up and down, just to play over those parts, if you do get that little weird pitching issue, then it should fix itself. And see, now it's out again. Just listen to the pitch here, then I'll go back and fix it. And yeah, now it's fine, it's back to normal. It's really weird. I hope they fix this soon in Ableton Live 11. And it's also scary because you could export your track and it will pitch up and down without you knowing. Or if you know, especially if you don't notice it, it is something that you want to double check once you export it. Okay, so that's sounding okay. As I was saying, make sure you capture the tail here. So if you have something that reverbs right at the end and you want to capture that, just drag out your loop point so that you catch that when you export. So once you've set up your loop point and your marker for where you want to export the track, second thing to make sure of is that we're not too loud in the mix. So I like to highlight all my tracks by shift selecting the top one and then the bottom one. That will capture the groups as well, like here. Since I'm not exporting all of these individually, I don't have to worry about the names as much. I just want to export the top group, so the effects group. As long as I have that selected, that's fine. So we want to make sure that we're not too loud in the mix. What we can do is go back to the session view, so hit tab. Every time you click this button here on the master, it resets where the highest point of volume occurs. Because I'm clicking it now, it's at negative infinite. If I start playing, it's going to show what the loudest volume peak was. So it's 5 decibels. Seems to be the loudest. Yeah, about -5. If I click it again, it resets. So every time you click it, it'll reset. Okay, now we're at -2. So I probably want to be a little bit lower. I'm just going to drag these down about 3 decibels. For the mixdown process, I like to be sitting at around -5 to 6 decibels. That way it gives us headroom when we go to the final process of mastering. But we are going to change these levels in a second anyway once they're exported. Just to be sure that nothing's actually clipping. And the handy way to do this is just to go to the loudest point of your track. So wherever all the sounds, the most sounds are occurring at once. For me, that's probably going to be in the drop. Okay, so I'm sitting at -4. That's fine. We're going to tweak these volumes anyway once we export them. And the bass is doing its weird thing again. I think it's because I don't have that pitch glide in these ones. I'll just double check this. Yeah, whereas these ones, I do have that little pitch glide. So if you pause the track halfway through a pitch bend, it'll keep that pitch bend. And then when you start playing around, you start playing it over here, it'll keep the pitch bend that where you paused it. So it's just really weird. Just be sure to keep an eye on that if you are pitch bending your sounds. So this is all pretty much ready for me to export now. So make sure all your sounds sound how you like them. Don't worry about EQing, compression, or limiting in here. We're going to do that separately. So as long as they sound how you like them creatively, you've got your returns set up, and you've sent them to returns if you want to. You've got them all grouped and named properly. The volume isn't peaking too high, so I like to keep it under -3 or 4, just for this process. And then you've got your loop points set correctly. We're finally ready to export this track. When it comes to exporting for your mixdown, what you do is just select all your top groups. So for me, that's just shift selecting from the top here to the bottom, and that way I get all those selected. Then we can go to File. I think it's chopped off at the top there, but if you go to File, and then you'll see Export Audio Video, hit this. Now we get a bunch of options. Let's take a look at these. First things first, where it says Selection up here and Render Track Master, we don't want to render the master. We want to render what we've just selected. So what we can do is click this drop down here, and then we can go to Selected Tracks Only. So we're going to click this. You'll see the one above says all individual tracks. You can do this as well, but if I did this, it would export everything inside this FX group separately as well, whereas I just want to export the top group. So what I like to do is just go select the tracks only. That way I just get my selection and nothing inside the groups. Render start 111, that's correct. And then make sure your render length is correct as well. If you set this right, it should be. Just check the bars here. See how it says 67 bars? And I can tell by looking at this up here that I have around 67. So I know that Ableton's chosen it correctly. So I can leave that. So select the tracks. Render length is fine. When we get to the rendering options down here, just leave all of these off. So all of these are off. The sample rate can be 44-100 or 48K. Just one of the between those two. You don't need anything more than that or anything less really. I think I had mine set to 44.1 purely because my sound card worked better with that, and I think I had some samples as well that worked better with 44.1. But if yours is set to 48K, just leave it there, and that will be fine. And honestly, you're not really going to notice the difference once you go any higher, unless you have superhuman ears. But the file sizes just get stupid once you go up here. So we keep this at 44.100 or 48K. Once we get down here, make sure encode PCM is on. So we want a wave file. Make sure this is set to wave. Bit depth, leave it as 24. Don't go any higher or lower. This seems to be a great middle ground when I've spoken to a lot of mixing engineers. They like 24 bit depth, and usually 48K or 44-100. Might just switch mine to 48 for this. Leave dither to off. Essentially what dithering is, if you use a lower sample rate, so let's say you go down to from a 16 down to an 8 or something, you will need to dither, because the dithering is how it processes the actual waveform to make up for the reduction of bit depth, if that makes sense. But in simple terms, we're not exporting anything that low, so we don't need to worry about it. Next one down is MP3. I'm going to turn this off. Yours might be already off. I had it on because sometimes I like to export a track as an MP3 just to test it on some other speakers, or upload it to my SoundCloud privately so I can listen to it, whatever I want to do. And this just gives me a small file. Obviously we don't want to upload it to SoundCloud, so we leave this off, and no video, so make sure all this is off. So essentially it's just selected tracks only. Make sure this is correct. Everything else should be off. Just leave it at 48K if yours is at 48. Encode PCM is on. Make sure it's set to wave. 24 bit depth, no dither, and then the rest off. So now we're finally ready to hit export. So I'm going to hit this. Now this is going to take a little while, so I'm actually just going to skip the video here, but depends on how big your track is, how many instruments you have, how many audio effects you have on those tracks, all those things, your track length, basically however big your project is, it's going to take longer. So I'm going to hit export. Now it'll ask me where I want to put it. I suggest making a folder, that way your stems get exported into here. That's another term I haven't introduced you to yet, is stems. So these are all called stems. Once they're exported individually, we in the music industry we refer to them as stems. So if a mixdown engineer asks you, could you export the stems for me, that's basically what he means, is to export your tracks individually. So all you have to do at the top here for the naming is just insert the name of your track. So for me, I'm just going to call it example. And then you can just leave that how it is, and Ableton would automatically add all these names of the tracks onto the end of it for you. So that's pretty much it. You hit save and then it will start exporting. So I'll see you once we finish exporting this. Okay, so that actually didn't take too long for me. Now if I go to my Finder or your File Explorer and you go to that folder, you'll see now you have all these stems in here with whatever track name you had, and then the actual name of the instrument after. This is why I want you to name all your tracks, otherwise you're not going to be able to tell what these are if it just says audio 1, audio 2, MIDI 1, MIDI 2. It's just going to get really confusing. So name all your tracks, and then once you export them as stems, it's going to be nice and neat for you. After we've exported our main stems, so these ones that I had highlighted here, we then have to go in and select our returns, and we have to do them separately. Unfortunately, Ableton doesn't let you pick your main tracks and the returns at the same time. So if you do have information on these returns, we have to export those as well. So exact same process. I'm going to highlight these 3 returns here and make sure my time range is set correctly. Then we come up to File, Export. We have to have selected tracks only on up here. So it's just the returns. And double check all this, it all looks good. It should remember your settings from last time, so you won't have to change anything as long as you haven't done anything since you last exported those stems. And then we can just hit export. So again, I'm going to leave the name as what I had it initially, so just example. And then it's going to add those return tracks into here with my other stems. So I'm just going to hit save and let it do its thing. Now if I check that folder where we had our old stems, we can see the new returns have been put in here as well. You can tell if they're the returns because they have the letter before the name. So we got A reverb, we got B long verb, and C delay. This is why it's important to name your returns as well, just to make sure you know which one's which. So if you're using different sized reverbs, make sure you name them accordingly, or different sized delays. And any other audio effects, just make sure you name them so that the returns correspond to what the effect is actually doing. Now that we have all of these exported nice and cleanly, we're ready to start our mixdown process. So instead of trying to pack this all into one video, I'm going to do it in the next video. So get all your sounds sorted out, make sure they're sounding how you want them to creatively, go through those steps that I explained. And then once you get to this point here where you have your stems ready to go, I'll catch you in the next video.